the worst year in Apple history was 1996, before Steve Jobs comes back, when Xi Jinping comes into power. And within a day, CCTV broadcasts a big thing against Apple. And they're going through 3 weeks of being attacked in China before Tim Cook issues an apology in Mandarin on the Apple website in China. The Hong Kong protesters were using an app that was helping them organize, and Apple just took it out of the App Store because Beijing asked them to. Manufacturing is going to be, Hangzhou versus Suzhou versus Shenzhen versus Chengdu. It's not going to be America versus China. America's going to become irrelevant. I really push back against the idea that 20% of iPhones are coming out of India. I'm trying to tell a history of China's rise through the lens of the world's most iconic company.
Hey, Patrick. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. And hello and welcome everybody to Prime Venture Partners. I'm Pankaj. And today, as I introduced, we are joined by Patrick McGee. He's an award-winning journalist who led Apple coverage for the Financial Times and has spent years, I think decades, reporting on companies' relationship with China. More recently, Patrick is the author of Apple in China, The Capture of the World's Greatest Company, a deeply reported account that draws on hundreds of interviews, internal memos, and on-record conversations to trace how Apple's massive investments in China kind of help build out the country's electronics manufacturing ecosystem, and how that dependence has sort of created a strategic and commercial dilemma for Apple as a company. So today we hope to dig into his reporting process, the surprises he found, while researching about the book, writing the book, and what Apple's story could mean for founders and brands, working or building out of India or building out globally. Especially the supply chains, especially the companies that are sort of dependent on scaling supply chains, manufacturing, or their global go-to-market strategies. Patrick's reporting has already sparked kind of wide conversation in the tech and policy world, and I can't wait to get into it. So Patrick, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Pankaj. Looking forward to it.
Fantastic, right? So, let's kick it right off the bat, Patrick. So you've been leading Apple's coverage for, I don't know, maybe like more than a decade or close to two. So what first drew you to Apple as a beat, right? How did your view of the company kind of evolve as you started spending more time? Would love to kind of know that and, kick it off.
Yeah, so it wasn't a decade. I've been at the FT for 12 years, but I was covering sort of Asian markets out of Hong Kong for 3 or 4 years. Then I went to cover German industry, which was kind of my introduction to going in and out of factories and understanding the supply chain, global supply chain, but the automotive one more than anything else. And then I covered out of California, Apple for 4 years. And I kind of joke about this, but I sort of think the book came out of the failure to cover Apple well, in part because it's a really difficult company to get inside, and in part because I realized that I didn't actually care for most scoops about Apple. I don't care for most tech reporting about Apple. And I say that because far too much of it is just sort of pressing fast forward on what Apple is already going to tell us. I don't think it's a great feat of journalism to be able to find out if the next product is going to be called the iPhone Air and is going to be a couple millimeters thinner than the previous one. I'm not saying there's no value in that, but that's not really investigative journalism. And so much of Apple reporting is based on that. I mean, when I was doing the dishes earlier, I was watching a new CNBC video, and the access that CNBC has to all these Apple executives is pretty extraordinary. I mean, I can't get that kind of access. But of course, why do they get that access? It's because they're just doing Apple PR by just getting inside the company and asking why it is that the company is so great. I mean, and it's just kind of silly. I don't even think it's journalism. So I'm sort of against the sort of rise of YouTube journalism and product reviews over the last 20 or whatever years. And it just struck me that there was a massive opportunity to really do a deep dive into Apple. And so, biography isn't the right word because it's a company, but I would call this the unauthorized biography of Apple over the last 25 years, rather than, sort of what the company wants you to think about the company.
That makes sense. I don't think I have gone through a non-fiction book as fast as I have read your book, to be very honest, Patrick. One of the reasons for that is, obviously the insight, the whole narrative shaping, and kind of bringing it all together with these deep dives actual kind of, former engineers and executives that you spoke to, right? So I'm just curious, right? How did you kind of manage, or what is your reporting process generally like, right? As you were sort of seeking the answers. And how are you able to talk to, um, senior executives, even though they might have left the company so far, but of a company which is known to be, or known to take its secrecy quite seriously, right? So I'm just curious, how you kind of were able to
Yeah.
gather
It's a good question, and I only can speculate as towards the answer because as the journalists who got these people on the phone, it was never a good idea for me to say, "Why are you talking to me?"
yeah, true.
This sort of implies. So, look, I would say I reached out to far more people than actually spoke to my, if you digit percentage. But I reached out to enough people that you sort of the law of big numbers, I think, works in your favor. And so if you reach out to enough people, even if only a fraction respond, you can still get to 200 plus people. So that's one answer. A second answer is that, most of the people I spoke to who went to China, either they lived there or they were just taking flights there all the time. Or if it was before 2003, then often they were in Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Czech Republic, Mexico, Wales, places like that, because Apple really didn't consolidate their operations into China until 2003. And that was all like a pretty untold narrative that Apple was manufacturing in all of those countries. And I want to be clear, not just sourcing parts, right? But actually that's where the facilities were. You're assembled in Wales. I think people have either forgotten this or just never knew. I never knew. Um, I think there was a sense among those people that they fulfilled their tasks really well, but it's not the decision they would have made. They weren't the head of strategy who said, "Hey, why don't we build everything in China?" And so there's a sense of disquiet within the company, or at least within the engineers I spoke to, that they don't love how captured out there. So in other words, I spoke to lots of people who it's not so much that they agree with my thesis, it's that my thesis is based on talking to them, right? And so it sort of came out of it that way. This I didn't have some sort of dogmatic sense of what the story was going to be and then sort of fit in the details. I just had a broad sense of what the contours would be, and then I got filled in by all these people. I suppose the third thing is just that if you do things chronologically in a 3 or 4 decade history, the people in the 90s, they're not concerned about some NDA they might have signed in 1996, right? Apple's not going to come after them for talking about the secrets of plastic injection molding or something like that. And so they were pretty free and willing and said, "What do you want to know?" kind of thing. And then by the time I was speaking to people of the iPhone era, let's say, I could name drop so many people and details. And of course, just by the nature of how this works, the people in 2005, if you're talking about the people in 2001 or 1998, there's a good chance they're senior people on the team that you'd already spoken to. And so they would get the sense, okay, I'm not really divulging the details here. Patrick already knows quite a bit about this, etc. And so you just sort of created this effect where every person I spoke to was already comfortable that I already knew quite a bit of the narrative, and they would be surprised at how much I knew of the narrative. And then they were just willing to correct a few details or corroborate something or add something, etc. And so, it'd be difficult just to get the first person on the phone, but the second, third, fourth person on the phone wasn't as difficult. And of course, last thing I'd say is the best question I could ask at the end of an interview is, who else might be able to speak to me about these things, right? And then I would get a list of 5 names, maybe their phone numbers, maybe their email addresses, and maybe the person would want to say, "Don't use my name when you connect with this person," and maybe they'd be fine with it. But that's sort of how I built up the sources. It was really sort of a organic effort. I didn't know how many would talk to me, but if there's one thing that the book got right, or at least that I got right in the research, it was how many people spoke to me. It was an extraordinary number of interviews, and frankly, just packaging it all together into one book was probably the most difficult thing about the book. I think I was drowning in novel information, and I didn't know how I could write it all in 40 tight chapters.
So you kind of had the arc of the book kind of chalked out already when you kind of went out to talk to these people, or that kind of informed, after a few conversations, maybe some stories, some narrative started emerging. So what did that look like, right? At what point did you realize that, okay, there is a larger story to be told about Apple plus China, right?
Um, let's see. So the basis of the book pitch, which ended up being a 70-page book pitch, was a 6,000 word article split into two, published almost 3 years ago in the Financial Times. And I remember the night before it was published, I was sort of disappointed in the article. And in hindsight, this was a stupid thing to think. It's a great article. I'm really proud of it. But when you're a journalist and you're really in the weeds on something, you sort of lose a grasp of what other people know about a topic. And so I felt that I had uncovered quite a bit. But I knew that I was only scratching the surface of a much, much bigger story. The contours of the story were pretty simple to come up with because I knew early on that like the worst year in Apple history was 1996 before Steve Jobs comes back. And that's also the year that they went from making their own computers strategy. And the outsourcing was the story that's the story I wanted to tell. So I knew, okay, we'll start in 1996, right? I think I had an early inkling that they began mass production of stuff in China, between 2000 and 2005. So that was probably going to be another vector. And the iPhone is in 2000. The biggest hole in my book pitch is I didn't have anything interesting to say about 2007 to 2013. I knew that 2013 was the political awakening of Apple in China because I'd already spoken to people about that, and it was very public when Xi Jinping comes into power, and within a day, CCTV broadcasts a big thing against Apple, and they're going through 3 weeks of being attacked in China before Tim Cook issues an apology in Mandarin on the Apple website in China. And then I knew, of course, of COVID, and COVID was I don't want to say a global pandemic was helpful. Obviously, it was terrible, but it was helpful for the narrative in that it got people thinking about supply chains, right? Supply chains are the nervous system of capitalism. They're incredibly important, but most people's eyes glaze over if you start talking about supply chains. There's probably some people who just left the podcast, right? It's that sort of nature. So the contours were there. I just needed to fill in all the details.
So how should these founders and executives think about building resilience, building, I guess, diversification in their supply chains, right? What would be your recommendation? How should these founders think about it, right? I guess that is the broader question I have, right? Because you can't live with China, you can't live without China, right? So it kind of needs to be the right balance, right?
Especially if you're a startup.
Yeah.
Almost by necessity is to base things in China, because the idea that you're going to just build things up in the United States or India and be competitive, I mean, my God, are you adding a secondary challenge to your efforts?
Yeah.
So it's quite different if you're like a Dell or a Microsoft, already a giant, you're building hardware. Maybe you have some operations in China. And then for those people, I would say my advice would be like, my chapter on sort of Apple consolidating into China is called Siren Song, because the sense of ubiquitous, dynamic, hardworking labor, baked in at a really low cost. I mean, that just made everything move to China. And anyone, and I'm sort of thinking of Tim Cook here because he gets called Mr. Spreadsheet. Anyone looking at global operations is just going to see over and over again that every product manager for independent projects are all going to choose China because it's the only country on the planet that had the capacity to meet the demands in terms of the quality and the scale and the cost. And so if you're the sort of manager higher up, I think you'd have to sacrifice some of those metrics. Now, for Apple, I don't think it's a contentious message because Apple's enormous and has more resources than it knows what to do with. And to say to Apple, look, I know you didn't mean to do this, and every decision you made over the last 25 years was rational, but you've actually put Washington in quite a tough spot here because the result of training 30 million people and spending probably more than $800 billion over the last 25 years in building up China is really that you've allowed our biggest adversary to weaponize the world economy against us.
I think one related question, right, is sort of what trade-offs, and I think you mentioned it in the book, right, but would kind of love to hear here as well. What trade-offs did Apple accept, right? Whether it's in terms of control, their ability to maintain secrecy, or kind of protecting their IP, or I think I remember this anecdote from the book where they had to kind of make peace with certain labor practices that they came across, right? So what trade-offs did Apple make to kind of get to scale, and which of those should startups should be more wary of repeating in your view, right? Because they have to make some trade-offs, right? Which one should they kind of make peace with versus looking back now, which one would you suggest they should be like wary of making?
Tough question. It's a fair question, but the answers differ pretty wildly depending on like what era of Apple or what product it is that we're talking about. So, for the iPhone, for instance, I mean, Apple's able to get real hardware excellence out of China in such great quality and quantity, all at a reasonable cost. And the result of that is that Apple, although they've never had more than 20% market share for the smartphone, they retain more than 80% profits. I mean, that's just a stunning statistic. It should sound to someone who hasn't read the book like I just had a massive verbal typo, right? I mean, find me another industry where there's a minority player commanding four-fifths of global profits. That just doesn't happen. That's extraordinary. One of the trade-offs, though, was that the content on the phone, the services available on the phone, aren't really quite available in China the way they are here. And what I mean by that is Apple has had no counterweight when they are asked to get rid of the New York Times, when they're asked to get rid of more than 600 VPNs, when they're asked to get rid of encrypted apps like WhatsApp. If they had half of their operations in India and they said, look, if you make these demands on us, we're just going to make 60% or 70% of our products in India next year instead, because we don't like being treated this way. Yeah, I think honestly, China might have very well had to back down and probably wouldn't have even made the request. But because Apple doesn't have that as an argument, Beijing can sort of have their way. There's nobody preventing them from having more rigorous laws against content on the iPhone because there's nothing Apple can do about it effectively. I've not heard any instances of Apple really using whatever political capital it has to sort of fight against. When I was a reporter, right? I used to live in Hong Kong, massively in favor of Hong Kong being, not a separate country per se. I mean, that would be sort of nice in a way, but the agreement that they signed, Deng Xiaoping and Margaret Thatcher in 1997. Well, I guess it was signed before then, but it was enacted in 1997 where Britain handed over Hong Kong, and it's supposed to last for 50 years, like any other city-state in China. And Apple basically played a role helping that take place because the Hong Kong protesters were using an app that was helping them organize, and Apple just took it out of the App Store because Beijing asked them to.
Yeah.
Right? So, if you really take that seriously, I mean, that's Apple siding with an authoritarian regime against people using their democratic rights to sort of, defend small L liberal values against an authoritarian. So that would be a massive trade-off. I think there's others, but that's maybe the biggest one that I would cite.
Yeah. Makes sense, right? So you know, what I took away from that is that it's not just that Apple's manufacturing was concentrated in China, but the fact that the Chinese consumer market accounts for like whatever 15-20%, I think you mentioned in your book, like a lion's share of Apple's business, right?
Yeah.
So do you think if it was just sort of manufacturing dependence or assembly dependence, and let's say China as a consumer market was not as significant to Apple, probably I think the dynamics would have been different. My related question to this is also that, how should Indian brands think about balancing? Because most of the Indian brands, as I said, right, are kind of catering to the domestic consumption story.
The only thing I would say, just to sort of put it back into the stuff that I know, is that, Apple's feeling was as long as we innovate, we'll just stay ahead of everybody. And even when Apple was really facing pressure in 2014, where Chinese competitors were sort of fast following, there was a sense within Apple, and you could see it as realistic or perhaps arrogant, depending on your perspective, that there was almost a sense that Apple innovating and other people following was actually helping Apple because the more that they created a design and then everybody followed, the more it sort of reinforced the image that Apple is ahead, right? And some executive told me, and they're quoted in the book saying, if they're fast following what we've shipped, they're not fast following what we're about to ship. And so we're always going to stay a little bit ahead. I think in retrospect, that proved to be arrogant. And I say that because Johnny Ive, of course, leaves the company in 2019 as chief design officer. Nobody has filled that role. I mean, it has been 6 years and Apple doesn't have anyone attempting to be Johnny Ive. And I think, maybe that wouldn't be problematic if all the phones coming out were just, badass and awesome. but I think most phones basically look derivative of what came out in 2019, if not what came out in 2000, 12.
Mm.
So I think Apple's sort of lost its cool in a certain sense. But, we're speaking just shortly after the iPhone Air came out. And,
Mm.
I'll give Apple points for that. That was a pretty cool phone.
Mm.
But it seems to be like once every 5 years, they're doing
Yeah,
something substantial to the design. And it used to be every 12 months. But
sure.
if I'm being sympathetic, I would also say that, they've sort of nailed the form factor, right? Them and the Android competitors. You're not just going to have a glowing iPhone just because you can make it in that shape, right? A sort of 6.5 inch or 5.5 inch rectangle that sits in your pocket is kind of an unbeatable form factor. I'm probably more optimistic about Apple selling hundreds of millions of iPhones than I am in Meta selling glasses, with a little display embedded in them. So it's hard to say, has Apple sort of given up its design mojo, or is the form factor of the smartphone just so sort of saturated as to where it is that we should stop expecting them to reinvent the wheel. They don't need to, so they're not doing it. That's actually kind of tough to say, and I think about that question quite a bit.
Kind of going back to your sort of journalist time, right? Do you see any policy moves that any region or a country could make that over, let's say, a decade or so can kind of reduce the dependence, or do you think it kind of will pan out the way it does?
I think there's certain things that we can learn from China's own industrialization. Put it this way, you're going to learn far more from reading about Shenzhen as
Mm.
an experimental economic zone than you're going to learn from the UK's Industrial Revolution. And yet, the number of students that are studying the UK's Industrial Revolution in the West, I'm sure far outweighs the number of people that are studying Shenzhen.
Then,
Um,
okay. Mm.
so the idea that you have sort of a carved out area of the country where you're just allowed to operate in a different way, where factories can be put up really quickly, where certain laws don't apply, and so forth. I mean, also to have several of those zones with different experiments going on so that then you can see what works, what doesn't, and then maybe replicate that across the whole country. I mean, that was the brilliance of Shenzhen. And I believe there are dozens, perhaps hundreds of special economic zones around the world. I mean, it's not a novel idea to say, hey, we should do what Shenzhen did. But I think there's not great examples of people properly really understanding everything that went on in Shenzhen. There's always a sense that like if you just have some certain top-down reforms, everything will fall into place. But a lot of what happened in Shenzhen was really sort of grassroots movements. To some extent, it wasn't, officials having the top-down correct view. It was actually them turning a blind eye as, rural migrants sort of flowed into Shenzhen at a rate that nobody was really expecting. But they allowed them to do it. And then they sort of allowed the, villagers that used to basically be on a fishing village to rent out their apartments and indeed to actually build up, 6 floors of their apartments and then rent those out and earn money. And so you had a sort of rentier class that wasn't sort of associated with like, fat cat landlords, but actually just people that were like on the lands beforehand. And it gave them an investment in the growth of their area. And then that's happening as you're drawing in foreign capital. So my point is, it's not a novel thing to say, why don't we be like Shenzhen? What would be novel would be to really take a detailed study of the lessons and then actually apply them in a way that sort of, copied elements of the Chinese political system where the local cadres, in addition to the villagers, are incentivized for the growth, right? I mean, there's a great New York Times piece by Kyle Chan maybe 3 months ago that talked about how in the future, manufacturing is going to be, Hangzhou versus Suzhou versus Shenzhen versus Chengdu. It's not going to be America versus China. America is going to become irrelevant. That is kind of the trajectory we're on right now. India has labor rates comparable to what China was 20 years ago. Obviously, it has more than 1 billion people. I think the differences between India and China are quite profound. The similarities are superficial. And so it's not anything like a copy and paste job of what Apple did in China, and then you're just going to apply it in India. There were all sorts of differences, and you're probably going to be a lot more fluent in them than I am. But nevertheless, what India has in terms of its advantages, I think are really quite compelling to Apple, or really any corporation that's overly dependent on China, which is a long list. I think those companies are often really just like desperately hoping that India plays a starring role in their China plus one strategy. But it's really tough to compete with China, and I don't know that India is doing enough. And I shouldn't even say India because I'm saying India like it's the whole country, but it's not, right? It's Karnataka, it's Tamil Nadu. It's going to be local government ministers who are going to have to sort of reframe how Westerners view India as a manufacturing base. Because when I talk to these people, entrepreneurs, they're citing the corruption, they're citing the speed, they're sometimes citing a pride among the workforce of saying, we don't want to be taught, we know how to build this stuff. And the Apple people in the factories are being like, right, but you don't, because there's a reason why we're doing this in China all the time, and that our aspirations in India aren't going as quickly as we'd like. So I don't know how one gets around those challenges, but they're large. But the lure of India, I think, is huge. And I would just love India to play a massive role in manufacturing over the next 15, 20 years. And if there's one lesson from my book, it's that if you can get Apple operations in your country, they will train up your entire workforce, not just for one supplier, but frankly, dozens and maybe later hundreds of suppliers to get everything up and running. And it can play massive benefits for the industrialization of what's now today, a fairly rural nation.
Very interesting. I think, well said, right? I think some of these kind of challenges we as a country and our administration has to kind of overcome. But I think, as you said, right, they have been, I mean, Apple as a company has been committing quite serious investment, right, over the last few years. I was reading somewhere now 20% of the world's iPhones or something like that gets produced, at least one of the model, I'm not sure which one, get produced in India. So they've ramped it up pretty quickly, right? And yeah, we need to kind of uh, grasp that opportunity that is available. So to kind of
So
close, sorry, Patrick, you're saying something.
I was just going to say, I really push back against the idea that 20% of iPhones are coming out of India. They might be coming out of India in the sense of tariff law,
Mm.
where, if a phone is essentially made in China, all the parts and stuff are sourced in China, and then
Mm.
the final step is quote unquote made in India. In terms
Okay.
of tariffs, that's a substantive change to the product, and the box can say made in India, but it really isn't made in India. And I don't say this to sort of discredit India manufacturing. It's more just that I want people, readers, but particularly readers in India, to know that it's not as though you're sort of halfway to challenging China. It's probably 1 or 2%, and the effort that's going to be needed is monumental. And so I
Yeah.
just don't want anyone to get the sense that we're almost there. In terms of America trying to compete, for instance, with TSMC by having a fab in Arizona, or frankly, a few fabs, there's a sense too in which, oh wow, we're really diversifying and we're building fabs comparable to Taiwan. And like, no, you're not.
Yeah.
Sorry, Arizona, you're not
Yeah.
close to competing with Taiwan, and so much more investment and long-term strategy is needed there. And I would say the same for India.
No, absolutely. I 100% get it, right? Because as I said, the founders and the companies, even though they are small, which are seeing this challenge that I spoke about earlier, right? When I talk to them and understand, like, why can't you move the whole thing to India, right? So it's not about just kind of putting the final product together, right? It's that a very small piece that goes into the product, right? That as a consumer you can't even see, but that's super important, let's say, to the structural integrity of the product. I do not have sourcing for that in India.
One other thing on this topic, I would say
Yeah.
that when China was getting involved, especially for Apple, let's say in the early 2000s, I mean, the countries to compare with were Japan, Korea, Taiwan, maybe Thailand, Singapore. China was bigger than all of them combined, right? And so what they could offer was next door manufacturing, where instead of building an iMac G4 in Taiwan, but having a bunch of parts sourced from all these different countries that were all obviously separated by bodies of water, they could just put everything in one district. And
Yeah.
that was phenomenally helpful for Apple and for any number of companies. When India is trying to compete, they're not the biggest, right? They're competing against China. And
Correct.
so it's a really different task that India has because China exists, right? If for whatever reason China just banned Western companies from operating in the country, then all of a sudden everyone would be in India. But the trouble is that's not going to happen. And so China just presents the biggest challenge to India being able to replicate what China has to offer. Because I can tell you this, I mean, China doesn't want India to be a big
Absolutely.
manufacturing rival. And so if they need to sort of prevent machinery or prevent Chinese people with experience from going to the production lines, they will absolutely do that. And they are absolutely doing that. What Apple didn't understand as a red flag was really counterintuitive. And it was that Chinese companies were bending over backwards to take their orders and really respond to them.
Yeah.
And, I mean, I remember an engineer telling me everywhere we went in China, the red carpet was rolled out for us. And I just don't think Apple asked the question, why is the red carpet rolled out for
Uh,
us, right? And it's
Interesting.
because they weren't thinking of the other characters' motivations and incentives and what they were trying to do. And so they're kind of stunned and taken aback when in mid 2000s, Beijing government is sort of trying to get more Chinese companies moving up the value chain. China doesn't want to just be stuck doing the low value added assembly. They want to be doing more of everything from the cutting and tempering of the glass to the actual chip fabrication for the memory and the CPU and the phones. And Apple's asked to help in those regards. And not thinking that it could say no, they end up working with YTMC, which is a memory maker that is considered a national security risk by Washington. So those are the little red flags. In other words, the red flag wasn't like something going wrong. It was so many things going right and not asking why are they bending over backwards to do all of this? And it's
What
because
was the
they have this
motive?
ulterior motive of sort of like, being the only place possible for you to build everything. Um,
Makes
so
sense.
that's one answer.
No, makes sense. I think makes a lot of sense. One book, article, or any resource that you would recommend to the founders thinking about supply chains right now. Of course, Apple in China is top of that list, but what outside of that?
When I was talking about Shenzhen earlier, a book that I recently read that was really quite influential to me, and I wish I had read it before I published my book, is called The Shenzhen Experiment. Apple's not a big player at the time, so Cisco is one of the key examples, and it's about Cisco moving things to China. I want to say the author's name is Barry something, but then it became a book, and the book is also worth reading. It's called End of the Line. But that assumes that your listener, your reader, is interested in some of the history, and I got really into the history. If someone wanted to understand the sort of topography of manufacturing within China today, I don't know what book actually makes that description. And I should say, I mean, if there's any journalists, especially Indian journalists listening, my God, does there need more written about these topics? I mean, there is not a biography of Terry Guo in English. I mean, he's the Henry Ford of Asia. He's
Absolutely.
retired. He's run for the Taiwanese presidency twice. He's a fascinating character. It's ridiculous that we don't have a 400-page biography of the
Yeah,
guy.
absolutely.
And there's not a single volume on Foxconn, which is probably one of the most, I mean, first of all, in terms of revenue, it's up there in the most, 20 most revenue generating companies on the planet, but it's probably one of those 20 most important companies on the planet. And for there not to be a deep dive into that company is preposterous. So it's like, I guess what I'm saying is the books that I want to recommend don't even exist. And how sad is that? To some extent, I think that just reflects the nature of journalism over the last 20 years, where we've sort of had, decreased funding and instead we're chasing eyeballs and clicks rather than doing big deep dives. But to some extent, it's that most of the action for this stuff is taking place in a country that doesn't have a free media. And companies like Foxconn, anyone associated with them is under strict NDAs, and so they can't really talk about it. So yeah, I don't have a big library of great supply chain books. I don't think on the whole that they've been written.
Understood, right? So one last question, right? Would love for you to maybe give a 60-second summary of your book and why and who should be reading the book, right? And where can they find it, right? And we can close with that.
I mean, from the get-go, the hope was that people interested in technology, business history, or geopolitics, and especially if you're interested in more than one of those, that you would be interested in the book. It's a history of Apple. I mean, it really is the first 21st century history of Apple. But even if you don't care about Apple products, it nevertheless serves as a pretty good primer on US versus China in terms of technology, the importance of that race. And even, if you don't know anything about Chinese politics or Chinese history, I think it's a pretty fun vehicle little bit. I mean, there are some great books written on China, don't get me wrong, but I don't think most people are reading them. China books don't sell well. I've been reading quite a number of them. I really like them, but my neighbors aren't reading them. And so Apple in China, I think, tells enough of the broad story of, everything from Taiwan and China having a civil war, to there being a rapprochement in the late 80s where the Taiwanese engineers end up going over and help building up the mainland, to the sort of multinational playground era of Hu Jintao, to the rise of Xi Jinping and him being something like China's Putin and taking the country in a different direction. I think it gives you a pretty good understanding of how China became the world's manufacturing juggernaut. So whether or not one's interested in Apple, I'm sort of telling a micro history. I'm trying to tell a history of China's rise through the lens of the world's most iconic company, and a company that's consumer facing and that, frankly, most of the listeners probably own some products from.
Yeah.
But Apple's almost like the excuse to tell a wider story.
Makes sense. Well said. Super, super awesome. Thanks a lot, Patrick, for doing this. Really appreciate it. I had a fun time talking to you. As I said, I loved your book.
Dear listeners, thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast app for free, and you'll be the first one to know when new episodes are available. Just search for Prime Venture Partners Podcast in Apple Podcast, Spotify, Castbox, or however you get your podcasts. Then hit subscribe. And if you have enjoyed the show, we would be really grateful if you leave us a review on Apple Podcast. To read the full transcript, find the link in the show notes.